I could not write a novel about a crime reporter. And so then 5 years after that, maybe I tried again. And then 5 years after that. And so this book has been sitting there waiting to be written for a while. And it did never happen. And I think I convinced myself it never would. And then I had written, I don't know if you all know this, but I've also written young adult books. And I wrote a young adult series called Night School, and it finished. And then I was kind of at sea as to what to do next. And everybody, my agent, my publishers, they're all like, what young adult novel are you going to write next? And I was like, God, let me just think about it for a while. And something will come to me. And my agent had a baby, and she went on maternity leave, and she was gone. And our goodbye had been that I would write a new young adult novel. And I sat down to write a young adult novel, and I started writing about a crime reporter named Harper McLean in Savannah, Georgia. And and she was not there to stop me, because a baby's very time-consuming. And so I thought, well, while she's away, I'll just play around with this idea, and then it'll be terrible. And I've never been able to write this book, and I won't be able to write this book. And then she'll come back, and I will have a great idea for a young adult novel. And she was gone for 5 months. And when she came back, I presented her with the entire manuscript of The Echo Killing and said, so I didn't write a young adult novel. Do you hate me because I wrote this? And I always wanted to. It just wrote itself in that way. It's been a long time since I just sort of vomited up a book, as we call it in publishing. I sat down and thought, I will write a book, and wrote 3 chapters in a day. And then the next day I wrote 3 chapters again. And it was time. The same book that had refused to be written in 2003 and in 2013 and in 2016 suddenly wanted to be written. And it was just this amazing, magical, enjoyable experience. And I could hear her in my head. And I could hear, Luke, the cop who helps her who shouldn't help her. And I could hear her mentor, the chief detective. I knew them, I could see their faces. And when that happens, that's a magical experience that we don't get that often. It's just when it does happen, you think this is the time for this book. So in that way, I had little control over where it went. And instead of changing her, giving her ethics, in fact, she's entirely driven by her own background. And that changes the plot, because she has to act according to what traumatized her, and that is her mother. Always there, that loss, that unsolved crime. And I have this theory that unsolved crimes scar us as society, collectively, particularly a murder, and particularly of a young person. And her mother was in her early 40s when she was killed. She had a life of great promise. She was an artist, and it just ended. And that would leave a scar that I think would just stay with you forever and impact all your decisions. And I wanted to kind of be true to that, because one of the things we've talked about before is in writing crime, we both try to write crime in a real enough way that we look at the impact it has on the lives of the people around them, because crime doesn't just affect the victim, it affects their family, their friends, and even the people who encounter those people later are affected by it. It has what you've called ripples. The crime is the pebble in the lake, and then those ripples of the impacts on character lives, that is just, for us as writers, that's so interesting to look at and to take that into account and to be true to that. And so that, I think, was the main thing that The Echo Killing did, was make me be true to her background and never forget it. And I've recently completed the second book in the series. And again, because that always is there, I write, each book has a crime in it that is resolved. But then, and I write that crime, and I love that crime. And then I go back again to the beginning, and I say, now, Harper's mother was murdered. Now, how's that gonna, and then I adjust it, and I feed in that to it. And that is, I love that kind of series. I'm just having so much fun, you guys. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens, a little bit about Cornwall and why you chose Cornwall. And Cornwall is a beautiful area in the south of England. It's sort of the Riviera of England, if England has one, which is to say it rains slightly less often. And it has lovely beaches, which I've been to Cornwall 3 times, and every single time it rained every doggone day. And I would go, we'd be there, doing things you do when it's raining, so you can't go to the beach. And on, the last day of our vacation, we'll be it's what, 50 degrees, it's raining, it's misty, by golly, I'm going to see the sea, so we are going to drive to the beach, and then we'll stand on the beach, and my hair is blowing out of my face, I'm being lashed by the rain, it's beautiful! I love it here! So Hal kind of has the same experience, as I recall, when she goes to Cornwall.
See, I would like to defend Cornwall because I have had many beautiful sunny holidays in Cornwall where we only needed to wear 3-season wetsuits to go in the sea. The sea of Cornwall is very, very cold. I mean, it's the Atlantic. But Cornwall has a lovely climate. It's often sunny. But having said that, my book is set in November and it does pretty much either rain or snow or, essentially it's bad weather the whole time. So I'm probably undermining my own case a little bit here. Why did I decide to set it in Cornwall? I don't know, because having written 3 books in sort of quite, not exotic locations exactly, but certainly locations that were not very close to home, when I started writing this, I thought I'm going to open it in Brighton, which is my hometown. And it does open in Brighton, but about 10 minutes into the manuscript, I pick Hal up and whoosh her off west down the country to Cornwall, which is, as Christi said, it's very beautiful. It's very remote. It's physically very far from the rest of the UK. The connections aren't great. The roads are pretty much appalling. They're all kind of these sunken single lane kind of little windy lanes that you can only get one car down, and if you meet a flock of sheep coming the other way, that's it for the day. You're not going anywhere. But it's also, as well as being very touristic and very beautiful, it's also a place of enormous poverty. I think it's one of the poorest counties in the UK. So you have this very divided community. And of course, the other thing about Cornwall is it has this tremendously long history, which I don't know if anyone here watches Poldark, but that sort of, the Cornish tin mines and copper mines they're still there, and you can visit them. And the history of Cornwall is very present in the landscape. So I love Cornwall. We holiday there a lot, and I guess partly it was just a chance to kind of spend a bit more time there in my imagination. But partly I think the reason I chose to do it is because when I wrote In a Dark, Dark Wood and The Woman in Cabin 10, a lot of the early reviews compared it to Agatha Christie, which I took as a huge compliment because I love Christie. I think she's one of the best mystery plotters there is. Nobody does that thing better than she does, where you get to the end of a novel and those pieces suddenly click into place, and it's so satisfying. Even if you figured it out, just seeing it all kind of interlock it's brilliant. But the one thing that Christie doesn't do super well, in my opinion, is character. That's not true of all of her books. Some of her books are brilliantly characterised, but some of them it does feel like the plot came first and the characters are there, these sort of slightly cardboard entities being kind of pushed around in service of the plot. And the writer that I always go to for character is Daphne du Maurier, who wrote Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel and Jamaica Inn and Frenchman's Creek and many more incredibly beautiful books. By the way, Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel are not usually shelved as crime. They're often shelved as romances, but do not be deceived. They are not in any way romantic. They are straight up psychological thrillers, and they are terrifying. And I read Rebecca as a 15-year-old and thought it was hopelessly romantic, and then returned to it in my 30s and realised that it was a hideous portrait of one of the most toxic marriages in existence. So that was fun. But anyway, Daphne du Maurier set all of her books in Cornwall, and the thing that she does really well is a sense of place and a sense of setting. The characters in her book are fantastic, but the setting is as much a character as any of the people, and that's one thing that I love when I read, and it's something that I try to do in my books as well. But we've been talking for ages, haven't we? Do you think we should we throw it open? Do you guys have any questions for either of us or both of us? We can keep talking all night, but you've probably got homes to go to, so yeah, lady in the middle.
Just following up at my question, you have to do with the fact that both books seem to have the setting is just as important as any of the other characters. So how do you go about finding the right setting?
I feel like I talked a bit about that already, so
I'll grab it. I can sort of answer that because she asked first how do we go about finding the right setting, because setting for both of us is almost a character in the books. And it's funny because it kind of finds you. I mean, when I was writing The Echo Killing, I was determined not to set it in Savannah, because I didn't want anybody to think it was autobiographical, and it's because it isn't, and I don't know why I cared. Why do we care about these things? And so I wrote a whole first draft with an invented town called Aurora that looked like Savannah and sounded like Savannah and smelled like Savannah, but wasn't Savannah, ladies and gentlemen. And so then the first person who read it is a friend of mine who's a novel editor, and her one note was, "That's Savannah." She's American as well. She lives in England, but any American recognizes Savannah. It's just like, that's Savannah. You want to make it a character, let it go back, rewrite it, set it in Savannah. And when I did that, because the whole time I've been like, this is not Savannah, even though it has squares, and it was in the Civil War, and it, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil might have been written about Aurora, and who was I kidding? Rewriting it with Savannah, and it made me so happy. Once I was in there, and it's a city I love in the same way you love Cornwall. It's a place that I just think of so fondly, and I had such, I could just visualize everything. It just fell into place. Everything just clicked right. Everything that was missing came there. So sometimes you can deny it, but it's tricky. You do look around. Where am I going to set this? My young adult novels are all set in the south of England, and there was no place else I could have put them. That just felt right for them. And your earlier books, The Woman in Cabin 10 on a cruise ship, I've always thought that was just an inspired setting, because every time, and this happens a lot, you guys, have you noticed this? Since reading your book, because I've never noticed it before, I have read at least 3 news stories about murders on boats, or at least disappearances on boats, where people get on and they do not get off. And this is a thing. I am never taking a cruise. It's really dangerous. So what got you to, had you read these articles, or did you just envision it? Did you know before that this was a thing?
Yeah, specifically with The Woman in Cabin 10, I did know. And I'd read an article. It was a case very, very different to the one that I imagined in The Woman in Cabin 10. But I'd read an article about a woman who had disappeared on a cruise ship, and what the article went into in quite some detail, which is something that's sort of briefly explained in the book, is this weird grey legal situation in terms of deaths at sea. So apologies to anyone who knows this, because I'll be repeating it, but if you die on land, it's very clear, there's a police jurisdiction, everything's investigated, it's very nice and clean cut. If you die in international waters, it's not investigated by the closest police force, it's not investigated by the police force of any of the participants, it's investigated by the police of the jurisdiction where the boat is registered. And often for tax reasons, that's quite weird, little out-of-the-way places like the Cayman Islands or the Bahamas. So you can have a situation where a Finn is hit over the head by a Frenchman off the coast of Greece, and there will be a 2-week wait while the one police officer on this tiny, Caribbean island flies in, by which point the CCTV footage has been lost, the cabin has been cleaned, because the boat has no incentive to want one of their personnel possibly involved in a murder investigation. So unfortunately, statistically speaking, if you die on land, you have a pretty good chance of your killer being found. If you die at sea, more often than not, there's no resolution. So if you're going to kill someone, international water. My lawyer requires me to say this is not legal advice. But it's what useful advice we're giving you tonight. But since writing it, obviously there was this incredibly tragic case of the journalist who was killed on a submarine off the coast of Sweden, and a lot of people who've read the book since have assumed that I based it on it, and I would just like to say no, I didn't. In fact, I probably wouldn't have written the book if it had happened, if the idea had come to me afterwards, because I would have felt it was too close to home and a bit disrespectful. So yeah, is there another question? Lady right at the back.
What are you working on now? What's next for you?
I'm writing book 5. Because I write a book a year, I usually have to hand it in the summer for publication the following summer. But because I've been doing a lot of events in Europe and also meeting you lovely people here, I basically had to say to my publishers, look, I can write the books or I can promote the books, but I can't do both. I'm not one, like Joe Nesbo apparently writes all of his books in hotel rooms and at airports. I'm not that writer. I need my desk, I need my computer, I need my own space, I need some peace and quiet. So yeah, I'm not writing at the moment, and they have very sweetly said I can have until November, which is very exciting. I get an extra 4 months, which is a long way of saying I'm writing book 5. I'm about 30,000 words in, but I can't tell you about it because I might jinx myself. But maybe Christi has a better answer.
I've just finished the second draft of The Echo Killing 2, which continues to follow Harper. The Echo Killing 2, I'm very happy to be able to tell you, is called A Beautiful Corpse. And do you like the title? Because we really struggled with it. And I love it. But it has corpse in the title and it freaks people out. But it's a beautiful corpse. Exactly. And it is about it starts with a murder in the heart of Savannah's tourism district. A young local woman is killed. And it looks at how that impacts the town, because as Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil changed the town and left it, it made it more affluent, but also incredibly reliant on tourism. It lives or dies by the tourist dollar. And it also has as a city, has a real bad crime rate. At the moment, it's really struggled this year in particular. And so it kind of looks at how those things, when the city has a lot at stake and a murder threatens everything that it relies on, what might it do to protect itself? So yeah, that's the beginning of that. So more questions?
In your writing, what used to be stumbling blocks or time consumers for you now that you've learned to avoid or do very quickly?
I'll have a quick go. For me, my first couple of novels, I didn't plot very well. I mean, there's those of you who are writers or aspiring writers know that most novels are divided into two camps: plotters, or as they call them, pantsers, people who fly by the seat of their pants when they're writing. And I didn't know this when I sat down to write, but I was a pantser, and that takes a long time. Like writing when you're just letting the elements come to you through inspiration, it's a slower process. And when I started plotting more, so I always write out, I always know where I'm going before I start. And that's learning that, and learning what worked for me, and that some writers outline every inch of their novel before they start writing. And that is not my way. Because if I have an 8-page synopsis, when I get to the 8th page, I'm just itching to get down and write chapter 1, and I've got enough. I know everything I need to know to get started. So that was key to me, to getting me writing very quickly. But what about you? Is it Twitter?
God, I was just being intimidated by the idea of an 8-page synopsis. I don't think I've ever written more than 2, if that. Yeah, I only write synopses when my publishers threaten to withhold the money unless I tell them what the book's about. I do think what Christi said in terms of the idea of having an idea of where you're going is key. I think that's often what beginner novelists struggle with. They have a great jumping off point, but there's no sense of direction because they don't know how the book is going to resolve itself. So it's sort of like getting in a car and just randomly driving without any sort of sense of where you're heading to. Even because I think of my books a bit like a car journey, in the sense of I always know where I'm starting because I've often been thinking about those characters for several months before I start writing. And I know where I'm going in the sense of I usually know who has done it. I normally know the rough solution to the mystery, and I generally have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen to the characters, although sometimes they surprise me. But what happens in between is completely up for grabs. Rather like when you're on a car journey, you know where you're heading to, but the route that you take, the shortcuts that you take, the crazy driver who cuts you up at the junction and makes you jump, all of that is kind of up for grabs. And I think for me that's important because I write to answer questions for myself. When I know when a book idea is a good idea, when it poses lots of questions in my head and when I can't wait to answer them. And I think if I knew the answer to all of those questions before I started, I probably wouldn't actually ever sit down and write the book. The book I'm writing at the moment I think I've got like less than a paragraph of outline that just basically, it's basically the jumping off point, and I gave it to my publisher because they wanted to know what it was about, and everything else is up here. So I hope that if it's a good idea, it will stick, and if I forget about it, it probably wasn't that great of an idea in the first place. But that's not really answering your question, which is what did I learn? In one way, I don't think my process has changed that much, and that's maybe because I wrote an awful lot of books before I got published. So I always wrote, right from when I was a little girl. I was scribbling little stories, telling my sister tales about our teddies, and my Barbie dolls had these amazing kind of Jackie Collins love lives where they were always kind of having feuds and jumping into bed with each other, and the stories just got longer and longer and longer until eventually I was writing full-length novels, and that pretty much was the case until I was in my 30s. That was when I started trying to get published. So I have maybe 12 or 15 books under the bed which I've written, which are not coming out, don't worry. They went under the bed for a reason, and they're staying there. But because of that, I'm quite confident and comfortable in my ability to spin a tale to get to the end. But I think what I've learned over the course of my published books is maybe two things. So the first thing is the thing that I kind of learned during my apprenticeship as a writer over my unpublished books, and that I think is that you have to give readers a reason to turn the page, and that the thing that makes a book exciting for you isn't necessarily the same thing as for the reader. By which I mean, usually as a writer, you know that something really cool is coming up. You know that someone's gonna, fall in love, or something horrible is gonna jump out of that closet, or someone's gonna get murdered. And so for you, what can feel like delicious anticipation, kind of working up to this event and dropping lots of little hints that it's going to happen, the reader doesn't know any of that. They don't know where you're going. They don't know that this is going to, that there's this promise of this juicy scene that you're working up to. And so for them, all of that can just feel like boring meandering. So you have to give the reader enough clues that the good stuff is coming, enough questions that they want to answer, enough theories that they want to test to make them turn the page. But in terms of my published books, I think my hardest book to write for sure was The Woman in Cabin 10, and I think that's because in A Dark, Dark Wood, I never expected to be successful. I wrote it thinking it was this weird little British book that maybe, some of my friends would buy, and hopefully my mother-in-law, because she's very supportive, she buys all my books. She doesn't read them, which is perfect. She always apologises, and I'm always like, please don't apologise, don't read them, they're full of swear words, and that's absolutely fine. I never expected it to sell abroad. I certainly never expected it to sell to Hollywood. I never in a million years would have expected someone like Reese Witherspoon to pick it up and put their name to it. So all of that was on one level a dream come true, but of course at the same time I was writing The Woman in Cabin 10, and I was feeling worse and worse about this poor little book that I was struggling to write. And I just got desperate to prove that I wasn't a one-trick pony, that I could write a second page-turning, interesting book that people would want to finish. And I think I threw everything but the kitchen sink at that book. I was so scared to let readers be bored for more than 5 minutes that, there's barely a page goes by when something isn't, some scary thing isn't happening. And I think what I've learned subsequently is just to kind of slow down a little bit, take a breath, admire the scenery, trust that my readers are probably not going to put the book down halfway through and abandon it if they've enjoyed my other works, and that maybe the characters will carry them through even when there's not the promise of something super exciting lurking around the corner. One more question. Yeah, lady at the front.
I read your books the first time. The Death of Mrs. Westaway, I listened to it as an audible. It was the first time. When you read it yourself, you hear your own voices, but when you do the audible, somebody else is reading it to you. I'm assuming you've heard it. Did you think she captured the characters in the way that you have written them? Because it's different when somebody else is speaking them.
I actually haven't heard The Death of Mrs. Westaway. I don't like listening to my own books on audio. It's a bit like, you know when you phone your own house and you get your answer phone and you're like, who is this awful, shrill person with a voice like a 10-year-old squawking away on the end of the phone? How does anybody put up with listening to this person day in, day out? Listening to my own books is a little bit like that. All I hear are the flaws and the things that I wish I would have changed and the bits that they read that weren't quite the way I meant them to be delivered. But I listened to enough of the first two to be pretty sure that I was impressed with the narrator and that I thought she did a really good job of capturing my characters. She's great at accents, which I'm not. When I read, I skip all the bits that require me to do regional accents. And she's just great. If it wasn't my book, I would love to listen to her. And I've been lucky enough to have the same narrator for all 4 of my books. So I'm confident enough that she's done a good job to recommend her. Okay, oh, that's a relief. Woo! Do you have an audio?
Oh yeah, I have a weird audio story in that my publisher got in touch with me when they had hired the person to read The Echo Killing and said, it's Sophie Amos, she's an actress, lives in New York, but she's a Southern history, and we hope you like her, let us know, because we really want her to read it. And so the last name was so familiar, Amos, and I couldn't quite place it. I used to, when I left Savannah, I moved to New Orleans, and I lived in New Orleans for about 8 years before moving to England, and I just thought that, wait, wasn't Jim Amos the editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune? And that's an unusual name even in New Orleans. So I Googled her, and she's from New Orleans, and there was no way it was a coincidence. She was definitely in that family. So then I tweeted her on Twitter, and she said, are you by any chance the daughter of Jim Amos? And she said, yeah, that's Jim Amos is my dad. And I was like, oh my God, I knew Jim. I was a journalist in New Orleans for 8 years, and she grew up as a baby crawling around the newsroom of the New Orleans Times-Picayune. News is in her blood. And it's just a coincidence. None of my publishers didn't know who she was. They didn't know who her dad was. She's an actress. And we were just having that internet hug you do when you're like, oh my God, you're reading my book, I think you're great. She's like, I'm so excited to read it. And she has the most beautiful voice, this husky. There's a slight hint of New Orleans still in it. And it was perfect. It was one of those serendipitous moments that just made my day. So yeah. And so I think that's all we have time for.
Hi everyone, if you can just stay seated for 1 second. So when you purchased a copy of either book, you got